There were 9 guests that Johnny Carson thought were the most unsettling. Johnny Carson entertained more than 22,000 people over the course of 30 years on The Tonight Show. Carson interviewed everyone from political dignitaries to comedy icons to regular people with extraordinary abilities, all with his signature combination of charisma, humor, and sincere interest. However, not every interview on The Tonight Show was successful. Carson was an astute observer of human nature underneath his charming on-air presence, a guy who had a sixth feeling for when a guest wasn't acting right. Carson always kept a level head, but close friends and family could tell when specific people were making him feel uneasy by the small changes in his body language, timing, and energy. The ability to remain calm under pressure was something Johnny possessed, according to a producer who worked with Carson for more than 10 years on The Tonight Show. However, on occasion while backstage, he would confess that some of the audience members had actually disturbed him. It wasn't because they were aggressive or tough. Carson was capable of handling it, but their presence and actions were very unsettling. The 9 guests that most unsettled television's most unflappable presenter are revealed today. The famous people whose performances made Carson visibly uneasy and who elicited whispers of their troubling traits. Even Johnny Carson felt uneasy in his own studio throughout these interactions, which ranged from maniacal passion to unnerving silence, garbled speech to icy antagonism. But before we go into that, let's figure out why our first entry made everyone feel uneasy. An appearance by the spectral figure of Truman Capote, one of America's most renowned authors, who was known for works such as In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's, as well as his distinctive voice and eccentric personality, made him a talk show regular in the 1960s and early 1970s. Carson felt as though he was interviewing a ghost for more than 20 minutes before the event. The Tonight Show appearances of Capote, however, took a sinister turn as his drug problems intensified, which really frightened Carson. A director who was involved with multiple of Capote's Tonight Show performances noted that Johnny found this aspect in Capote's later years to be profoundly unsettling. His speech would be so thin and hardly intelligible that he would pause mid-sentence and then resume as if nothing had happened. Johnny compared it as attempting to do an interview with a specter who kept slipping into and out of our reality. Capote showed up clearly drunk and began babbling incoherently about death, famous secrets, and paranormal experiences during one very unsettling performance in 1975. Capote brought an ethereal presence to the studio, which was a stark contrast to Carson's expectations of a clever and gossipy visitor. One camera operator who was there that night noted that the audience was on the edge of laughter and concern. Your ability to understand Capote was severely impaired due to his severe slurring. It was more than that, though. His presence had an otherworldly quality. After Carson, he continued staring into space, smiling at nothing in particular. Evidently unsettled, Johnny continued staring in the direction Capote was staring. Due to the interviewee's incoherence, the producers made the unusual choice to end it. Carson allegedly looked over at his producer after the commercial break and said something about how he sounded like a haunted house reminiscing. Carson proceeded to the next section when Capote's illness was reported. When the show returned, Carson found Capote unsettling for reasons other than his drunkenness. His physical weakness, his whispering intensity, and the distressing content of his rambling stories were all factors that made this disabled guest the most difficult for the host to handle. According to a writer who was there, Capote was telling these half-coherent stories about people he claimed, had died under mysterious circumstances. Then, giggling softly, Johnny tried to lighten the mood, but Caput would just stare at him with an unsettling smile and whisper, "You don't really believe that, do you, Johnny?" Carson kept up his professional demeanor throughout the appearance, but those who knew him well could tell he was genuinely disturbed. As one longtime associate observed, after the broadcast, Johnny said, "I don't mind challenging guests, but that was like interviewing someone who's halfway beyond the grave already." He was genuinely creeped out, which almost never happened. The experience was so unsettling that Carson temporarily suspended Caput from the guest list, not as punishment, but because the host found the experience so genuinely disturbing that he didn't want to repeat it. When Caput was eventually invited back years later, strict precautions were taken to ensure he was in better condition. But Carson reportedly remained wary throughout the interview. Number 2, Klaus Kinski, wild-eyed rage. German actor Klaus Kinski was known for his intense performances in films like Vera Herzog's Aguirre, The Wrath of God, and Nosferatu the Vampire. His volcanic temperament and unpredictable behavior were legendary in the film industry. When Kinski appeared on The Tonight Show in the late 1970s to promote a new project, Carson encountered a level of manic intensity that left him genuinely concerned for everyone's safety. From the moment Kinski walked on stage, there was this crackling, dangerous energy. Remembered a stage manager who was present that night. He had these wild, bulging eyes that never blinked, and he was literally trembling with some kind of internal rage. Johnny, who normally leaned toward guests, was actually leaning away from Kinski throughout the interview. What made Kinsick's appearance particularly unsettling wasn't just his intensity, but the disconnection between Carson's questions and Kinsick's responses. When asked about his recent film, Kinski launched into a rambling diatribe about art, religion, and the approaching apocalypse. When Carson attempted to interject with a light-hearted comment, Kinski fixed him with a stare so hostile that the audience audibly gasped. What had security staff on high alert that night? Revealed a producer who worked on the show. We weren't sure if he'd finished the interview or flipped the desk. It was seriously considered during the commercial break whether to cut the program short due to safety concerns. Johnny felt a great deal of anxiety. I could see him calculating exactly how to handle this unstable person without setting him off. Recalled Ed McMahon in a later interview. I wasn't conducting an interview so much as trying to prevent a public meltdown. The interview continued with Carson pretending to be calm while subtly physically separating himself from Kinski. According to crew members, Carson later claimed that this was the only time he had seriously worried that an on-air guest might become violent. Johnny told me afterwards that he felt like he was sitting next to a bomb that could explode at any second. Going to commercial has never made me feel more relieved. Carson was most unsettled by Kinsick's unnervingly focused attention and unblinking eyes throughout the section. Looking into Kinsick's eyes was like staring at an incoming storm. According to a camera operator who worked that night and recalls Johnny saying so, something dreadful was about to happen because you could sense the destructive power growing. The Tonight Show staff held the Kinski appearance in the highest esteem as the embodiment of terrifying intensity. Producers would reassure Carson, "At least it can't be worse than Kinski." Carson would respond, "No, I didn't win. I didn't lose either. There was no trial. There was nothing." Actually, Robert Blake, Cold Stares, and Hostility were the top 3. Films such as In Cold Blood and the hit TV series Beretta had solidified Robert Blake's reputation as a revered performer. His reputation for being both intense and genuine made him someone who may be an intriguing guest on The Tonight Show. Carson was unprepared for the torrent of barely contained animosity that Blake would unleash upon his entrance, leading to one of the most awkward interviews in the history of the program. One of the writers there at the event recounted how Blake suddenly became so antagonistic. He was more than just challenging. Many of the guests were problematic. It was the dead-eyed, icy look he gave Carson anytime the latter inquired. Something about it was really unsettling, as if he were plotting ways to hurt Carson in his head. The mood in the studio transformed the second Blake took a seat as a guest. In contrast to their usual light-hearted banter, Blake responded to Carson's questions with clipped, sarcastic remarks, frequently casting doubt on the premise or uttering a hostile, "Why would you ask me that?" Even when Carson tried to lighten the mood with humor, Blake would stare awkwardly into space for an uncomfortable amount of time before quickly ignoring the joke. The witness, a stagehand, recalled, "The air just went dead in the studio after the encounter. The audience stopped laughing. The band looked uncomfortable. It felt like he wanted to fight, not talk." Johnny kept trying different approaches, sincere questions, light banter, but Blake just sat there radiating this cold anger. What made the appearance particularly creepy wasn't just Blake's hostility, but the contrast between his controlled exterior and the sense of barely contained rage beneath the surface. A camera operator who worked that night remembered there was something deeply unsettling about how still he was. He barely moved, barely blinked, just stared at Johnny with these dead eyes while speaking in this eerily calm voice that didn't match the hostile content of what he was saying. Carson, drawing on all his professional experience, maintained his composure throughout the segment, but those who knew him well could see subtle signs of his discomfort. A tighter smile, a tendency to consult his note cards more frequently than usual, and a physical posture that created maximum distance between himself and Blake. Johnny told me afterward that he felt like he was being studied rather than having a conversation, revealed a producer who spoke with Carson after the show. He said, "I don't mind if someone doesn't like me, but Blake wasn't just unfriendly. Like a specimen, he was watching me." Years later, when Blake was involved in legal issues, Carson allegedly said to a coworker, "I'm not surprised. It was so unsettling. I felt like a predator was sizing me up." As a result, Carson made sure Blake wasn't scheduled again while he was host. The vibe emanating from that man was just unsettling. Ending an interview has seldom made me feel this relieved. Very astute. Love me even if you treat me badly and cruelly. Andy Kaufman, in the role of Tony Clifton, ranks fourth, enormous disorder. When Andy Kaufman made an appearance on The Tonight Show as lounge singer Tony Clifton, he was already well known for his innovative brand of comedy. Carson was uncharacteristically disturbed by the Clifton character's deliberately irritating and aggressive demeanor, which contrasted with Kaufman's more subdued performances as himself. An on-site producer from The Tonight Show noted that the Tony Clifton performance was one of a kind, since it was deliberately meant to be unsettling. While most annoying guests are just inconsiderate, Kaufman was purposefully trying to generate a creepy mood for his performance. The performance part was fine, but the creepy part was the real issue. Already in character, Clifton showed up to set with an ill-fitting tuxedo, a horrible wig, enormous sunglasses, the stench of cologne, and an aggressive demeanor toward the crew. His hostile behavior with female staff members began the moment he took a seat. He constantly interrupted Carson, insulted Ed McMahon, and refused to follow the conversational guidelines that normally shaped the interviews on The Tonight Show. An eyewitness to the appearance recalled that it wasn't simply that Clifton was annoying. Seeing someone stay true to themselves, even when everything was obviously falling apart, was actually unnerving. Every time Carson attempted to start a normal conversation, Clifton would answer with that unsettling non sequitur voice in that grating manner. It was unclear whether the persona had taken over or if Kaufman was still in charge. The scene came to a head when Clifton hurled a glass of water at musical director Doc Severson, seemingly unhappy with the band's support of his purposefully awful singing. Carson then made the highly rare decision to exit his own stage, allowing Ed McMahon to deal with the growing mayhem. Johnny was never one to go. A stage manager who happened to be there explained that's how disturbed he was. When he left, Clifton actually got worse, refusing to leave the stage when the commercial break came. Security had to physically remove him while he shouted obscenities. It was beyond uncomfortable. It was like watching someone have a psychotic break, except you knew on some level it was an act, which somehow made it even more disturbing. When Carson returned after the commercial break, he was noticeably tense, a rare crack in his typically unflappable demeanor. According to staff members, he later expressed that what disturbed him most wasn't Clifton's obnoxious behavior, but the total commitment to the character regardless of consequences. Johnny told us afterward, "I've dealt with drunks, egomaniacs, and people having meltdowns, but there was something genuinely unsettling about someone who refuses to acknowledge reality," remembered a longtime associate. He said, "It was like talking to someone who exists in an entirely different universe with different rules." That level of commitment to chaos creeped him out. The aftermath was swift and decisive. While Kaufman himself remained welcome on the show and made several subsequent appearances as himself, Carson personally requested that the Clifton character be permanently banned. As one producer put it, Johnny could handle difficult, but he couldn't handle disturbing, and Clifton crossed the line from difficult to genuinely unsettling. Number 5, George Jessel, racist relic. George Jessel was an old-school vaudeville performer and film producer whose career stretched back to the early days of the 20th century entertainment. By the time he appeared on The Tonight Show in the early 1970s, he was in his 70s and represented an entertainment era that had long since passed. What Carson couldn't have anticipated was how Jessel's appearance would create one of the most uncomfortable moments in the show's history. Jessel came from an era of entertainment where racial and ethnic jokes were standard fare, explained a writer who was present for the appearance. But by the 1970s, those kinds of jokes weren't just unfunny, they were appalling. Carson, who prided himself on keeping the show current and respectful, was completely blindsided by what came out of Jessel's mouth. The trouble began when Carson, after a brief introduction, invited Jessel to share some thoughts about his long career in entertainment. Instead of the light reminiscences Carson expected, Jessel launched into what a crew member described as a greatest hits of the most offensive material imaginable. A monologue filled with racist terms, stereotypes, and humor that might have passed in the 1920s, but was shocking to the 1970s audience. The studio went completely silent, recalled a camera operator who witnessed the moment. Not the uncomfortable silence where people don't get a joke. The horrified silence where everyone is collectively thinking, did he really just say that? Johnny's face froze in this pained smile. You could see him frantically trying to figure out how to stop this train wreck without creating an even bigger scene. What made the appearance particularly unsettling wasn't just the offensive content, but Jessel's complete obliviousness to how his material was being received. As the audience sat in stunned silence, Jessel continued as if expecting uproarious laughter, occasionally looking confused when it didn't come. Carson was trapped in an impossible situation, noted a producer who was in the control booth that night. If he directly confronted Jessel about the offensive material, it would create an on-air confrontation with an elderly man. If he laughed it off, he would seem to be endorsing these horrific views. If he abruptly cut the segment, it would be awkwardly obvious why. He was visibly uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. Carson's solution was to cut to a commercial much earlier than planned. When the show returned, Jessel had been replaced by the next scheduled guest. According to staff members, Carson was uncharacteristically upset backstage, telling his producer, "That was not what this show is about. It's never going to happen again on my watch." While many difficult guests were eventually invited back after a cooling off period, Jessel was permanently removed from Carson's guest list. The incident prompted the show to implement more thorough pre-inters, particularly for guests from earlier eras of entertainment. What disturbed Johnny most wasn't just the offensive content, explained a longtime associate. It was the way Jessel seemed to be a visitor from another time who didn't recognize or acknowledge how the world had changed. There was something genuinely creepy about someone who seemed completely disconnected from contemporary reality. The Jessel incident became a reference point for the production team. Whenever potentially problematic guests were suggested, someone would inevitably ask, "But could we have another Jessel situation?" The mere mention of the name was enough to make bookers reconsider. "Don't you like men's clothes all the time?" "No, I don't do it all the time. They're my work clothes." I mean, a lot of people pick up a work pail and a number 6 Divine. A shock to 1970s America. Divine, the drag performer who rose to fame through John Waters' transgressive films like Pink Flamingos and Female Trouble, was already a countercultural icon when booked on The Tonight Show in the mid-1970s. With an elaborate beehive wig, dramatic makeup, and a deliberately provocative persona, Divine represented everything mainstream 1970s America found challenging, making for an appearance that visibly unsettled even the normally unflappable Carson. This was long before RuPaul's Drag Race and mainstream acceptance of drag performance, explained a talent coordinator who worked on Divine's appearance. Having Divine on a mainstream network talk show was genuinely shocking for the era. Johnny, who was fairly traditional despite his progressive booking choices, was clearly out of his comfort zone from the moment Divine walked on stage. What made Divine particularly unsettling to Carson wasn't aggression or hostility. By all accounts, Divine was professional and well prepared for the appearance. Rather, it was the deliberate subversion of gender norms and societal expectations that created a palpable tension throughout the interview. Carson remained courteous, but was visibly unsettled, recalled a director who worked that night. He kept a slightly greater physical distance than usual. His laugh was more nervous than genuine, and he was off his rhythm for the entire interview. You could tell he was struggling to find the right approach. Should he treat Divine as a serious artist, as a novelty, as a provocator? He never quite figured it out. The studio audience's uncertain reaction added to the uncomfortable atmosphere. Some laughed nervously, others sat in confused silence, and network censors were on high alert for any content that might violate the era's strict broadcast standards. This created a strange energy that Carson, normally so in control of his environment, struggled to navigate. Johnny was caught between his responsibility to make guests feel welcome and his obvious personal discomfort, noted a writer who was present. He kept glancing at Ed McMahon like he was silently asking for help. When Devine made references to John Waters' films, which were famously transgressive, Johnny had no frame of reference. He clearly had no idea how to respond to mentions of the infamous scenes that had made Devine famous. While Carson maintained professional courtesy throughout the segment, those who knew him well could see his relief when the interview concluded. A producer later recalled, as soon as the camera stopped, Johnny turned to me and said, "Well, that was certainly something different for the folks in Omaha tonight." It was his polite way of saying he'd been completely thrown off balance. What makes Devine's appearance particularly significant is how it highlighted Carson's struggle to bridge the gap between his Midwestern sensibilities and the rapidly changing cultural landscape of the 1970s. His professionalism shone through even when he was visibly unsettled. He never treated Devine disrespectfully. The Devine interview was a turning point for Carson's Tonight Show because it showed that he was prepared to have guests who pushed the envelope, even if it made him feel uneasy. An employee summed it up best. Johnny might have been creeped out, but he never let his personal reactions get in the way of giving the audience something genuinely new and thought-provoking. So went the story cemetery. No one, as far as I can tell, could possibly advise him better. Is Mr. Vincent Price welcome? Vincent Price, number 7, spooky and dramatic. Vincent Price was one of the few people on our list who appeared on The Tonight Show often and was always well received. The iconic horror film star's distinctive blend of refined menace and charisma made for riveting television. The crew saw that Carson appeared genuinely unsettled by some parts of Price's histrionic character, even though the presenter obviously enjoyed being in Price's company. Johnny loved having Price as a guest. According to a veteran producer of The Tonight Show, there were times when he actually made Carson uncomfortable. Vincent has the ability to abruptly transform into his terrifying voice from his horror flicks, even while discussing seemingly innocuous topics like cooking or art collecting. Even though he was laughing, Johnny's bodily reaction was clear when he did. His uncanny knack for shifting from endearing row to terrifying presence was what made Price's appearances so disturbing. In a particularly memorable scene, the lights in the studio were turned down low and candles were lit to create the mood as Edgar Allan Poe read aloud from The Raven. Carson was captured on camera reacting in a very distressed manner as Price's voice intensified. The segment's director recalled that Johnny had later stated that he forgot they were on television for a brief period while reading. According to him, the room's temperature appeared to shift as a result of Price's voice. Following the performance, he playfully asked, "I think Vincent actually summoned something during that performance. Did anyone else feel a presence in the studio?" Carson frequently brought up the fact that Price had a disturbing vocal quality, making even compliments sound like threats, which was partially true. Price presented Carson with a mounted taxidermy bat in a miniature display box during one of his appearances. As he handled the preserved creature, Carson's reaction was a complicated blend of civility, fascination, and apparent discomfort. A writer who worked on multiple appearances by Price remarked that Johnny had a true curiosity with him and a genuine uneasiness when he was near. He had no ill will against Vincent, completely in reverse. At times, though, Price would lock eyes with Johnny or lower his voice dramatically, and Johnny would get the expression that seemed to say, "Is he still acting, or should I be worried?" What made this dynamic intriguing, though, was how cognizant Price appeared to be of his impact on Carson. On purpose, he would act out his macabre persona, shocking Carson with his unexpected appearance of prop spiders or rubber bats. These scenes strained Carson's composure, while simultaneously creating a light-hearted tension that the audience liked. A camera operator recalled an appearance in which Price was talking about a horror picture he had just finished shooting. In the middle of his terrifying description of a scene, he reached out and clutched Carson's wrist as he whispered something deeply disturbing. Astonishingly, Johnny sprung in his seat. After the fact, he informed us, "For a second there, I thought Vincent was actually going to bite me." It's indicative of a significant facet of Carson's psyche that Price may unsettle her while still being one of her most cherished regular guests. When an esteemed performer included periodic unease in their performance, the host may understand and even enjoy it. His behavior here was completely different from how he dealt with guests who caused an unintended disturbance. After one of Price's most dramatic performances, Carson made the observation that no one can scare you as much as Vincent, who leaves you hoping he returns soon. In a scholarly sense, of course. Sure thing. Not to mention my folks and the alcohol. I agree. He had a drinking problem. Margot Hemingway is the eighth alarming cyclone. One of the most famous models in the world in the late 1970s. Margot Hemingway was also the face of Fabra's Babe perfume and the granddaughter of Ernest Hemingway, the literary legend. At first, her Tonight Show appearances were all charisma and glitz. However, her final appearance in the early 1980s produced one of the most really unsettling moments in the history of the program, as her personal troubles became more intense. What should have been Hemingway's routine promotional presentation for the picture really turned out to be something more. A producer who was involved with the segment remembers that something was obviously off right away. She sounded lost, spoke erratically, and had these empty, watery eyes. Johnny, who was sensitive to guests' needs even in trying times, appeared worried instead than merely awkward. A deep detachment from reality, rather than aggressiveness or animosity, was what made Hemingway's appearance so unnerving. She would start to respond to Carson's queries, but then she would pause in the middle of her sentences and stare blankly ahead for unsettlingly long lengths of time. Then, without warning, she would pick up where she left off. On other occasions, she would answer questions that Carson had not even asked, giving the impression that she was taking part in a completely other interview from the one that was actually happening. A reporter who was there that night claimed that Carson continued looking for stable ground. In an effort to get reasonable answers, he would use basic, direct inquiries. However, Hemingway would respond with these seemingly unrelated remarks that failed to follow any logic. Johnny seemed to be growing more worried about her as a person, rather than irritated or frustrated. The unsettling ambience was heightened by the audience's response. There was awkward quiet in the studio, broken only by nervous coughs instead of lively discussion or laughter. Despite his usual skill at keeping the crowd engaged, Carson appeared unable to dispel the unease that had descended upon the venue. A director on staff that night noticed that Johnny's answers got shorter and shorter as the segment progressed. It was far from impolite. It was his attempt to lessen the impact. It was obvious he was uneasy, but not in the same sense that one feels uneasy When dealing with an unpleasant visitor, rather, it was as if he were observing someone in a true crisis. The subsequent revelation of context made this appearance all the more striking. Subsequently, Hemingway discussed her troubles with addiction, mental illness, and the expectations placed on her by her family's reputation. Carson appeared to know instinctively that the Tonight Show appearance captured a woman going through a very difficult time. A stage manager recalled that following the segment, Johnny exhibited an unusual lack of energy. That wasn't someone being difficult. That was someone in trouble. Carson quickly shut them down when someone made fun of Hemingway's mental illness, expressing his genuine distress about her actions and the insights it offered into her pain. After Hemingway's terrible suicide in 1996, many on The Tonight Show remembered that unsettling look as a warning signal that had been obvious but misunderstood at the time. As one producer reflected, Johnny was disturbed because I think he sensed the gravity of what we were witnessing. It wasn't just an awkward TV moment. It was a cry for help playing out on national television. This is like sitting at the World's Fair, riding one of those Ford machines. Number 9, Andy Warhol. The dead-eyed silence. Andy Warhol's appearance on The Tonight Show in the early 1980s was arguably the most conceptually unsettling interview Carson ever conducted. Not because of volatile behavior or concerning signs of personal troubles, but because of the artist's deliberate unnerving passivity and refusal to engage in the basic conventions of conversation. Warhol's appearance was more performance art than interview, explained a producer who worked on the segment. He barely spoke, gave one-word answers when he did speak, and stared blankly through Carson as if he wasn't there. It created this incredibly uncomfortable atmosphere that even Johnny, with all his experience, couldn't navigate successfully. From the moment Warhol took his seat, the typical rhythm of The Tonight Show was disrupted. Carson would ask full, thoughtful questions, and Warhol would respond with a single word or a slight nod followed by long, unblinking stares. When Carson attempted to use humor to break the tension, Warhol would offer a small, enigmatic smile that acknowledged the joke without actually engaging with it. The audience didn't know how to react, recalled a camera operator who was present that night. Was this a joke? Was Warhol trying to be tough on purpose? How timid was he? The studio was filled with a creeping unease that was caused by the uncertainty. Seated figures fidgeted, coughed uneasily, and glanced about as if to verify that what they were experiencing was indeed as strange as it seemed. Carson exhausted all of his extensive toolbox of interview techniques. Queries that allow for free form responses, queries that target Warhol's work specifically, anecdotes written with the intention of eliciting a response, and even remarks regarding the peculiarity of the discussion itself. The effect of Warhol's dispassionate observation was impenetrable. Johnny asked a journalist backstage, "Do you even want to be here?" At one point, instead of affirming or rejecting, Warhol simply shrugged slightly. I felt like I was interviewing a sphinx. You could tell Johnny was truly uneasy by his subsequent off-air quip. That man could be made of wax. The lack of typical signs of discomfort was what set Warhol's appearance apart from past challenging interviews. He lacked the aggressiveness of Robert Blake, the drunkenness of Capote, and the manic energy of Kinski. His presence, on the other hand, caused what one employee called an existential vacuum, which distorted the natural progression of events and interactions. The tone was neutral. A director who was on the set that night described it as existential fear. Warhol declined to take part in Johnny's reliance on the most fundamental human exchange. the connection that occurs via talk. Carson likened the experience to speaking with a specter who possessed knowledge that the interviewer lacked. I felt really uneasy. When Warhol made an appearance on The Tonight Show, it was like seeing the polar opposite of what the show stood for. He provided icy distance, awkwardness, and unease rather than friendliness, intimacy, and amusement. It was a very unsettling experience for Carson, whose job was based on making people feel comfortable. And after talk between Carson and a producer recalls that Johnny was both irritated and fascinated by the episode. He appeared visibly rattled by the interaction, not furious, but deeply troubled, as he added, "Either that was the worst interview I've ever done, or it was brilliant performance art, and I'm not sure which would bother me more." Among the personnel of The Tonight Show, Warhol's presence became famous as the benchmark for awkward silence. Carson made passing references to other challenging guests on occasion in subsequent years, but the Warhol interview was almost never brought up, as if it had been too deeply disturbing to revisit. Even looking back,